The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ravenscroft Manor with an apologetic quality, as though even the sun understood it was illuminating a house in decline. The once grand estate, perched on the edge of Somerset, with views that stretched across rolling hills and ancient oak forests, bore the marks of financial struggle in ways both subtle and glaring. Paint peeled from window frames. Gardens that had once been the envy of the county now grew wild and untended. The staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew, and those who remained did so out of loyalty rather than adequate compensation. Arabella Ravenscroft stood at her bedroom window, watching the gardener attempt to manage what had become an impossible task. She was 23 years old, an age that polite society whispered about with raised eyebrows and knowing glances. Her sisters had married at 19 and 20, respectively, both making matches that society deemed appropriate and advantageous. Eleanor had become the wife of Lord Pemberton, a man of considerable wealth and political influence. Beatrice had married Viscount Whitmore, whose family owned half of Yorkshire and most of its coal mines. Both marriages had been arranged, orchestrated by their father with the precision of a military campaign. Both sisters had accepted their fates with grace and resignation, understanding that duty to family superseded personal desire. Both had urged Arabella to follow their example, to understand that romantic notions were the privilege of those who could afford them. Arabella had other ideas entirely. She turned from the window, her reflection catching in the tarnished mirror above her dressing table. Dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, unpinned and unrestrained in a way that would scandalize any proper lady's maid. Her eyes, an unusual shade of amber that her mother had once called leonine, held a spark of defiance that no amount of societal pressure had managed to extinguish. She was beautiful in an unconventional way, with strong features that suggested character rather than delicate compliance. The knock at her door came with the predictable rhythm of bad news. "Miss Arabella." The voice belonged to Mrs. Hemsworth, the housekeeper who had served the Ravenscroft family for 30 years and had watched Arabella grow from a wild child into an equally wild woman. "Your father requests your presence in his study." Arabella closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself. "I'll be down shortly." She knew what awaited her. Another conversation about duty, about family obligation, about the precarious position they found themselves in. Lord Henry Ravenscroft had lost his fortune through a combination of poor investments and poorer judgment, trusting men who proved unworthy of that trust. The estate was mortgaged to the hilt, creditors circled like vultures, and the only asset remaining was his unmarried daughter. The study smelled of old leather and older desperation. Her father sat behind his desk, a man who had aged a decade in the past 2 years. His hair had gone completely grey, his face lined with worry and sleepless nights. Once robust and commanding, he now seemed diminished, hunched over ledgers that told the same grim story, no matter how many times he reviewed them. "Arabella." He looked up, and she saw exhaustion in his eyes. "Please, sit." She remained standing. "If this is about another suitor, Father, I must tell you, we are ruined." The words came out flat, devoid of emotion, as though he had rehearsed them until they lost all meaning. "Completely, utterly ruined. The bank has given us until the end of the season. If we cannot secure funds by then, we will lose everything. The house, the lands, everything that has been in our family for 6 generations. Arabella felt the floor shift beneath her feet. She had known things were bad, but this stark pronouncement carried a finality that took her breath away. "Surely there must be something we can do. We could sell some of the—" "There is nothing left to sell." Her father stood, moving to the window with the gait of a much older man. "Your sister's dowries depleted what remained of your mother's jewels. The artwork is gone, the horses are gone, the London house was sold last year." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that frightened her more than anger ever could. Resignation. "There is one option remaining. A gentleman of considerable means has expressed interest in meeting you." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Father, I have met a dozen such gentlemen, and each one has been worse than the last. Men who want a trophy or a nursemaid, or simply a woman too desperate to refuse their advances. I will not— This is different. Her father's voice carried an edge of desperation. The Duke of Ashford has requested an introduction. The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. Everyone knew of Vincent Hawthorne, the Duke of Ashford. At 32, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in England, perhaps in all of Europe. His wealth was legendary, his estates vast and profitable, his lineage impeccable. More remarkably, he had remained unmarried despite a decade of determined pursuit by every ambitious mother and daughter in society. The Duke was known for his intelligence and his standards. He had rejected countless matches, turned away from arrangements that would have been advantageous to any other man, maintained a reputation for integrity that was unusual among his peers. Rumors suggested he sought something more than beauty or breeding, though what that something might be remained a mystery that fueled endless speculation in drawing rooms across the country. The Duke of Ashford. Arabella repeated the name slowly, processing this information. Why would he possibly be interested in meeting me? I have no dowry, no connections, nothing to offer. He requested you specifically. Her father retrieved a letter from his desk, handling it as though it were made of gold leaf. He wrote to me directly, asking permission to call. He mentioned seeing you at the Worthington Ball last season and being impressed by your conversation about the Reform Act. Arabella vaguely remembered the evening in question. She had been cornered by a pompous baron who insisted women should not concern themselves with politics. She had responded with perhaps more passion than wisdom, citing specific provisions of the legislation and their likely social impact. The exchange had not been quiet, and she had noticed several people watching with varying degrees of shock and amusement. He wants to meet the woman who made Lord Ashbury turn purple with indignation. A ghost of a smile crossed her father's face, the first she had seen in months. Arabella, I am not asking you to agree to anything. Simply meet the man. Have a conversation. If you find him intolerable, I will not force the issue, regardless of our circumstances. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of their situation made such promises hollow. If she refused the Duke, what would happen to her father? To the servants who had served them faithfully? To the legacy of her family? The prison of obligation tightened around her, even as she tried to maintain her stance of independence. When is he expected? Tomorrow afternoon for tea. Her father's relief was palpable. Please, Arabella, just give him a chance, for all our sakes. That night, Arabella lay awake, staring at the canopy above her bed. The fabric was faded and worn, much like everything else in the house, a constant reminder of decline and desperation. She thought about her sisters, both seemingly content in their arranged marriages, though she suspected Eleanor's letters were carefully edited to omit any unhappiness. She thought about her mother, dead these past 5 years, who had married for love and paid for it with decades of genteel poverty before her heart simply gave out from the stress. The world was not kind to women who chose their own paths. Society had rules, expectations, consequences for those who defied convention. Yet Arabella had never been able to simply accept what she was told, to comply without question, to surrender her own judgment to the dictates of others. It was this quality that had kept her unmarried, while her peers settled into domestic obscurity. But now, for the first time, she wondered if her principles were a luxury she could no longer afford. Morning arrived with grey clouds and the promise of rain. Arabella dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue that had been altered twice to remain fashionable despite its age. Her maid, young Sarah, fussed with her hair, attempting elaborate arrangements that Arabella immediately undid in favor of something simpler. "Miss, you must let me do this properly," Sarah protested. "The Duke can expect whatever he wishes," Arabella replied, though without her usual conviction. "I refuse to pretend to be someone I'm not, even for such an illustrious visitor." As the afternoon approached, Arabella found herself growing increasingly agitated. She paced her room, rehearsed conversations in her head, imagined a dozen different scenarios, none of them comforting. The Duke of Ashford would arrive expecting a proper lady, educated in the arts of pleasing men and managing households. He would find instead a woman who read philosophy, debated politics, and questioned the very foundations of the society that shaped both their lives. It would be a disaster. He would leave within the hour, her father would be crushed, and their already dire situation would become completely hopeless. The weight of this impending failure pressed down on her with physical force. Then, as she stood once again at her window watching the lane that led to the house, an idea took hold. It was reckless, perhaps even mad, but it offered an escape from the suffocating expectations of the afternoon ahead. If the Duke was determined to meet Arabella Ravenscroft, let him meet the real woman, not the carefully constructed facade that society demanded. She summoned Sarah with unusual urgency. "I need your help with something," Arabella said, and the look on her face must have been alarming because Sarah took a step backward. "I need to borrow one of the staff uniforms." Sarah's eyes widened. "Miss, I don't understand. What are you—" "The Duke is coming to evaluate me like a horse at auction. I'm tired of being put on display, tired of performing like a trained monkey for the amusement of potential husbands." Arabella began unbuttoning her fine gown even as she spoke. "If he wants to know who I really am, let him see me as I would choose to be, without pretense, without games. Your father will be furious." Sarah's protest was weak, betrayed by the glimmer of mischief in her own eyes. She had served Arabella long enough to appreciate her mistress's unconventional streak. "My father is already desperate. What's a bit more scandal added to our considerable collection?" Arabella smiled, feeling something like her old self for the first time in days. "Please, Sarah, help me do this one mad thing. If the Duke is truly the man of character everyone claims, perhaps he'll appreciate the honesty. And if he's not, well, we'll have our answer that much sooner." 20 minutes later, Arabella examined herself in the mirror and barely recognized the reflection. The simple grey dress of a housemaid hung loosely on her frame, designed for practicality rather than fashion. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, covered partially by a white cap. No jewelry adorned her throat or wrists. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be, a servant, invisible to those of higher station. Sarah had given her a tray and brief instruction on proper serving technique, though both women knew this was a performance that could fall apart at any moment. The plan was simple. Arabella would serve the tea, observe the Duke without the pressure of being observed in return, and perhaps gain some insight into his true character before revealing herself. It was foolish. It was dangerous. It was the most liberated she had felt in months. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the Duke's arrival. Arabella's heart hammered against her ribs as she made her way down the servants' staircase, careful to avoid her father, who would be greeting his guest in the main hall. She positioned herself in the kitchen, where Mrs. Hemsworth was overseeing the preparation of tea with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. "You there, girl?" The housekeeper gestured to Arabella without really looking at her, too focused on arranging sandwiches on china plates. "Take this tray to the drawing room. Mind you don't spill anything. This is the most important visitor we've had in years." Arabella lifted the heavy silver tray, testing its weight. "Yes, ma'am." She walked through the house with measured steps, her pulse racing. This was madness, absolute madness. Yet she felt more alive than she had in months, energized by the audacity of her deception. Through the door of the drawing room she could hear voices, her father's nervous formality, and another voice, deeper and more assured. Taking a breath that did nothing to calm her nerves, Arabella pushed open the door and stepped into the room. Her father sat in his usual chair, looking more animated than she had seen him in weeks. Across from him, rising from his seat with the natural grace of someone accustomed to command, stood the Duke of Ashford. Vincent Hawthorne was not what she expected. The man was tall, certainly, with the bearing of someone born to privilege, but there was nothing soft or pampered about him. His features were strong rather than handsome in the conventional sense, with a jaw that suggested determination, and eyes of a startling grey that seemed to take in everything at once. His dark hair was slightly longer than fashion dictated, giving him an almost artistic air that contradicted his formal dress. He looked like a man who could be equally comfortable in a London ballroom or riding across his northern estates, someone who valued substance over appearance. And those grey eyes were now fixed directly on her. Arabella felt the full force of his attention like a physical thing. For a moment she forgot her role entirely, frozen in the doorway with the tea tray clutched in her hands. There was something in his gaze that suggested he saw more than a servant, that he was already looking beneath the surface to the truth she had tried to conceal. "Ah, excellent timing." Her father's voice broke the spell, though his tone carried a note of confusion. Had he recognized her? It seemed impossible given her disguise, yet something in his expression suggested unease. "Please, set the tray here." She moved forward, forcing her hands to remain steady as she placed the heavy silver on the low table between the two men. The Duke had reseated himself, but she could feel his gaze following her movements, with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "Thank you," Vincent said, and his voice carried a warmth that surprised her. Most men of his station barely acknowledged servants, certainly didn't thank them. "That looks wonderful." Arabella bobbed a curtsy, keeping her eyes downcast in what she hoped was proper servant fashion. "Will there be anything else, my lord?" "Actually," the Duke said, and she heard amusement in his tone, "I find I'm quite parched from my journey. Would you mind pouring?" This was not part of the plan. Serving the tea meant staying in the room, being present during a conversation that was supposed to be about her. Yet she could hardly refuse without breaking character entirely. Arabella reached for the teapot, acutely aware of both men watching her. "I must apologize for my daughter's absence," her father said as she poured, and she nearly fumbled the pot at this mention. "She was not feeling well this afternoon. A headache, I believe. Nothing serious, but she asked to be excused from today's visit. I hope you'll forgive the inconvenience of traveling all this way." "Not at all." The Duke accepted the cup she handed him, and their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange. Arabella felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite name, a sensation that traveled up her arm and lodged somewhere near her heart. "I quite understand, though I confess myself disappointed. I was looking forward to our conversation." "Perhaps another time could be arranged," her father suggested desperately, "when Arabella is feeling more herself." "Perhaps." Vincent took a sip of tea, his eyes never leaving Arabella's face even as he addressed her father, "though I wonder if Miss Ravenscroft might be more herself than we realize at this very moment." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Arabella's hand stilled on the teapot, her father's face drained of color. The only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock, counting off seconds that felt like hours. "Your Grace, I'm not sure I understand," her father began. "Forgive me, Lord Ravenscroft, but I think you do." Vincent set down his cup with careful precision. "I think we both do. Miss Ravenscroft, would you care to join us? As yourself, I mean." The game was over. Arabella had been caught, exposed, her ridiculous plan unraveled by a man who was apparently far more perceptive than she had anticipated. She should have felt humiliated, angry at herself for such a foolish gambit. Instead, she felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had suddenly lifted. She straightened from her servant's posture, removed the cap that covered her hair, and met the Duke's eyes directly for the first time. "How did you know?" "Your hands," he said simply. "No servant has hands like yours. And your bearing, the way you move, speaks of education and privilege, no matter what clothes you wear. But mostly it was the intelligence in your eyes when you thought I wasn't looking. You were studying me as carefully as I was studying you." Her father had risen from his chair, sputtering apologies and explanations that tumbled over each other incoherently. Vincent raised a hand to silence him, his attention remaining fixed on Arabella. "Why the disguise, Miss Ravenscroft? Were you testing me, or were you trying to escape?" It was the directness of his question that decided her response. Here was a man who did not deal in social pleasantries or meaningless convention. He asked what he wanted to know, and he seemed to genuinely want to know her answer. Both, perhaps. Arabella moved to sit uninvited in a chair that put her at eye level with the Duke. It was forward, improper, exactly the sort of behavior that had kept her unmarried this long. "I'm tired of being evaluated like breeding stock, Your Grace. Tired of performing for men who care nothing for who I actually am. I thought if I could observe you without the pressure of being observed, I might learn something useful. And if you prove to be just another fortune hunter or bored aristocrat, I could spare us both the waste of an afternoon." The silence that followed her words was absolute. Her father looked as though he might faint. Vincent Hawthorne, however, began to smile. It started at the corners of his mouth and spread slowly across his features, transforming his serious face into something warmer and more approachable. "That," he said with obvious delight, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years, possibly ever." "Your Grace, I must apologize for my daughter's—" Her father tried again. "Brilliance?" Vincent interrupted. "Courage? Refreshing lack of artifice?" He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease despite the chaos of the moment. "Lord Ravenscroft, I came here today hoping to meet a woman of character and independence. It appears I've found exactly that, though in a rather more dramatic fashion than I anticipated." Arabella felt her preconceptions crumbling like a castle built on sand. This was not how men of his station behaved. They were supposed to be offended by deception, outraged by impropriety, rigid in their adherence to social convention. Vincent Hawthorne seemed to be none of these things. "So you're not angry?" The question escaped before she could consider whether she wanted the answer. "Angry, I'm fascinated." He accepted a sandwich from the tray she had brought, taking a bite as though they were discussing the weather rather than her shocking breach of etiquette. "Tell me, Miss Ravenscroft, what else have you deduced about me from your observation? I'm genuinely curious what insights my brief presence revealed." It was a test, she realized, but one she was uniquely prepared for. "You're left-handed, which suggests a childhood where you were allowed to develop naturally rather than forced to conform. Your boots are expensive but worn, indicating you value quality and practicality over display. You thanked a servant, which is either calculated to appear humble or genuine decency. And you're here at all, which means you're either desperately seeking a wife for some reason no one knows, or you're genuinely different from your peers." "All correct," Vincent said, and she heard approval in his voice. "Though I should clarify the last point, I'm here because I read a fascinating article in the Westminster Review about women's education and property rights. The author argued brilliantly for reform, citing historical precedent and economic logic. It was signed only with initials, but I made inquiries. The writer was you." The revelation hit her like cold water. She had published that essay anonymously, never imagining it would be traced back to her. Political and philosophical writing was no occupation for a lady, and she had been careful to hide her involvement. "How did you discover—" "I have my methods." The Duke's smile turned conspiratorial. "Your arguments about women's capacity for business and finance were compelling. I happen to agree with most of them, which puts me at odds with the majority of my class. When I learned the author was an unmarried woman of good family, who was known for her unconventional views, I became curious. Then I saw you at the Worthington Ball, listened to you debate poor Lord Ashbury into stuttering incoherence, and I knew I had found someone remarkable." Arabella's mind raced to process this information. The Duke of Ashford, one of the most powerful men in England, had sought her out not despite her radical ideas, but because of them. He had read her work, agreed with her positions, wanted to meet the mind behind the arguments. It was so far outside her expectations that she struggled to find a response. "I don't understand," she finally managed. "Why would you want to marry someone like me? I'm everything society says a proper duchess should not be. I have opinions, I write, I argue with men who think themselves my intellectual superior. I'm a disaster waiting to scandalize your name." Vincent set down his teacup and leaned forward, his grey eyes serious now. "Miss Ravenscroft, I've spent a decade refusing matches with women who would make perfect duchesses according to society's standards. Beautiful, accomplished in all the approved arts, trained to manage a household and produce heirs without making any demands on their husband's time or thoughts. Do you know how utterly lonely that sounds? How pointless?" "Most men would disagree," she said softly. "Most men are fools." He said it without arrogance, simply as a statement of fact. "I want a partner, not an ornament. Someone who can challenge me intellectually, who has her own passions and pursuits, who won't simply echo my opinions to keep peace. I want conversation at breakfast and debate at dinner. I want someone who will read my business correspondence and tell me when I'm being an idiot. I want to be married to someone I actually like, not just someone appropriate. The words painted a picture so different from everything Arabella had been taught about marriage that she felt disoriented. That's not what marriage is, Your Grace. It's a business arrangement, a social contract, a means of producing legitimate heirs. Love and friendship are pleasant additions if they happen to occur, but they're not the foundation. Why not? The question was simple, but profound. Why shouldn't marriage be built on mutual respect and genuine affection? Why accept less when we could have more? Her father had been silent through this exchange, watching with an expression that cycled between hope, confusion, and dawning wonder. Now he cleared his throat tentatively. Perhaps I should give you young people some privacy to continue this conversation. That would be highly improper, Arabella said automatically. Good, Vincent replied. We've already established that propriety is not our primary concern. Lord Ravenscroft, thank you for the tea. Might I request permission to walk with your daughter in the gardens? I promise to remain in sight of the house at all times. Permission was granted with almost desperate enthusiasm. Minutes later, Arabella found herself walking alongside the Duke through the overgrown gardens of her childhood home, still wearing the grey dress of a maid, feeling as though she had stepped into some kind of fever dream. The threatened rain had held off, leaving the air fresh and cool. Vincent walked with his hands clasped behind his back, seemingly content with silence as they navigated paths that were barely visible through the encroaching wilderness. Your gardens have potential, he observed. They remind me of my estate in Northumberland. Wild but beautiful. Some things improve without too much human interference. Or they've been neglected because we can't afford gardeners, Arabella replied bluntly. There's no point in pretty metaphors, Your Grace. You know our situation. My father is ruined, and I am his last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. That's why you're really here, isn't it? Not because you read my essay or heard me argue about politics. You're here because you know I have no choice but to accept any reasonable offer. Vincent stopped walking, turning to face her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You think I would take advantage of your circumstances? That I'm the kind of man who would trap a woman into marriage because she has no other options? I don't know what kind of man you are, Arabella said honestly. We've known each other less than an hour, most of which I spent pretending to be your servant. You say beautiful things about partnership and respect, but words are easy. Actions matter more. You're right. He resumed walking, and she fell into step beside him. You have no reason to trust me. You've likely encountered enough men who said one thing and meant another. So let me propose something unusual. Let's spend time together over the next few weeks. Not as officially courting, not with any pressure or expectation. Just as two people getting to know one another. I'll answer any question you ask. You can observe me in various situations, form your own judgment about my character. At the end of that time, if you decide I'm worth considering, we can discuss the possibility of marriage. If not, I'll help your father manage his debts without any obligation on your part. Arabella stopped walking. You'd help us even if I refuse you? Why wouldn't I? Your father's financial troubles are the result of bad luck and worse advisors, not moral failing. He doesn't deserve to lose everything, and you certainly don't deserve to be forced into marriage with someone you neither respect nor like, even if that someone is me. Vincent plucked a late-blooming rose from a bush that had gone wild, examining it with the same careful attention he had given her. I've been fortunate in life, Miss Ravenscroft. Wealth I didn't earn, privilege I didn't deserve, opportunities that were gifts of birth rather than merit. If I can use those advantages to help good people in difficult circumstances, why wouldn't I? Because that's not how the world works. She heard the bitterness in her own voice. Men don't help without expecting something in return. They don't offer kindness without strings attached. Every gentleman who has shown interest in me has wanted either my family's name, whatever remained of our connections, or simply a woman too desperate to refuse their terms. You're saying you're different, but I've heard that before too. Vincent handed her the rose and she took it automatically. Then test me. Put me through whatever evaluation you consider necessary. I have nothing to hide and everything to gain by proving myself worthy of your consideration. He smiled, and she saw something genuine in the expression, something that made her chest tighten in a way she didn't quite understand. Besides, I rather enjoyed being observed by a serving girl with sharp eyes and sharper intelligence. I'd be delighted to know what else you might notice, given more time and better circumstances." Against her better judgment, Arabella found herself smiling back. "You really are different, aren't you? Or you're the most accomplished actor I've ever encountered. I suppose you'll have to spend enough time with me to determine which." Vincent offered his arm in a gesture that was both formal and somehow intimate. "What do you say, Miss Ravenscroft? Are you willing to give this unusual courtship a chance? Not for your father's sake or your family's circumstances, but because you're curious about what might be possible between two people who actually see each other as equals." Arabella looked at the rose in her hand, then at the man waiting patiently for her answer. Every practical consideration told her to accept immediately. His offer was generous beyond reason, his character appeared solid, and their circumstances left little room for refusal. But she had spent her entire adult life resisting pressure to compromise her principles, to accept less than she believed possible, to surrender to the inevitable simply because everyone else said she should. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "On one condition. You must promise me honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. I can forgive many things, Your Grace, but I cannot forgive deception. If we're to know each other truly, we must be willing to show each other the truth of who we are, not just the versions we think the other wants to see." "Agreed." Vincent took her free hand, holding it gently in his own. "Though I should warn you, the truth of who I am might not be as noble as you're hoping. I'm ambitious, occasionally ruthless in business, prone to working too many hours and sleeping too few. I have a temper that I've learned to control, but that still surfaces when I encounter stupidity or injustice. I expect a great deal from people, and I'm not always patient with those who fail to meet those expectations. I'm difficult to live with, according to my steward, and impossible to work for, according to my secretary. Still interested?" "More than I was 5 minutes ago," Arabella replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "At least you're honest about your flaws. Most men your age are convinced of their own perfection." They walked back to the house as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Her father met them at the door, his eyes questioning, hopeful, desperate. Vincent took his leave with proper formality, arranging to call again in 2 days' time, this time with Arabella present and appropriately dressed. After the Duke's carriage had disappeared down the lane, her father turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "What just happened?" "I honestly don't know," Arabella admitted, "but I think I might have just met the only man in England who isn't afraid of who I actually am." That night she sat at her writing desk long after the household had retired, attempting to make sense of the extraordinary afternoon. The Duke of Ashford was everything she had been told didn't exist. A man of wealth and position who valued intelligence, who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than just her bloodline, who spoke of marriage as partnership rather than ownership. It was too perfect. There had to be something she was missing, some hidden flaw or secret motivation. Men like Vincent Hawthorne did not remain unmarried until 32 by accident. There must be some reason he had rejected countless other matches, some explanation for why he would seek out a woman like her specifically. Yet even as she listed her doubts and suspicions, Arabella found herself remembering the way he had looked at her when she revealed herself. Not with anger at the deception, but with delight at her audacity. He had seen through her disguise not because she had failed in her performance, but because he had been watching closely enough to notice details others would miss. She pulled out her journal, the leather-bound book where she recorded her thoughts away from any possibility of judgment or censure. The pen moved across the page, almost of its own accord. "Today I met a man who claims to want everything I've been told makes me unmarriageable. He speaks of respect and partnership, of intellectual companionship and genuine affection. He knows I wrote the essay that horrified half of London society and seems to admire me for it. He discovered my ridiculous disguise and found it amusing rather than offensive. I don't trust it. I don't trust him. I don't trust that any of this could possibly be real. But for the first time in years, I want to believe. And I think that might be the most dangerous thing of all." She closed the journal and extinguished her candle, lying in the darkness with thoughts that refused to quiet. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own revelations. But tonight, for just a moment, Arabella Ravenscroft allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she had resigned herself to. A future where she might actually be happy. The following morning arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that seemed designed to mock Arabella's confusion. She dressed carefully, this time in her own clothes. A morning gown of sage green that had been altered so many times it practically knew her shape by heart. Her hands trembled slightly as Sarah arranged her hair, and she caught her maid's knowing smile in the mirror. "You're thinking about him," Sarah said, not quite managing to keep the romantic speculation from her voice. "The Duke. Everyone in the servants' hall is talking about yesterday. They say he actually laughed when he discovered you were pretending to be one of us. Everyone is talking about my latest scandal, you mean?" Arabella tried to sound dismissive, but her reflection betrayed her with colour rising in her cheeks. "I'm sure the entire county will know by week's end that I served tea dressed as a maid to the most eligible bachelor in England. They'll also know he stayed for an hour after discovering the truth, and that he's calling again today." Sarah secured the final pin in Arabella's upswept hair. "That's not the behaviour of a man who was offended, miss. That's the behaviour of a man who's interested." The observation settled into Arabella's chest with uncomfortable weight. Interest was dangerous. Interest led to hope, and hope was a luxury she had learned to live without. Better to expect disappointment and be pleasantly surprised than to dream of happiness and have those dreams systematically destroyed. Yet she couldn't quite suppress the flutter of anticipation as the morning crawled toward afternoon. Vincent had promised to call at 2 o'clock, and she found herself watching the clock with an attention that would have embarrassed her if anyone had noticed. Her father certainly noticed. Lord Henry Ravenscroft appeared in the doorway of the morning room, where Arabella was ostensibly reading, but actually staring at the same page she had been on for 20 minutes. "We need to discuss yesterday," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movements of someone nursing both physical and emotional exhaustion. "The Duke's offer to help us regardless of any marriage arrangement." "It's generous," Arabella acknowledged, setting aside the book she wasn't reading anyway. "Suspiciously so. Or it's the action of a man of genuine character." Her father studied her with an intensity she found uncomfortable. "You've spent so much time protecting yourself from fortune hunters and opportunists that you've forgotten some men actually possess integrity." "Have I? Or have you forgotten that integrity is often a performance? That men present themselves one way during courtship and reveal their true nature only after vows have been spoken and escape becomes impossible?" Arabella heard the bitterness in her own voice and regretted it immediately. Her father had enough burdens without her adding to them. But he surprised her by nodding slowly. "Your mother said something similar when we were courting. She had seen too many friends trapped in miserable marriages to trust easily. I had to prove myself over months before she believed I meant what I said about wanting a partner rather than a possession." This was new information. Arabella had always known her parents' marriage had been a love match, scandalous in its time because they had chosen each other against their family's wishes. But she hadn't realized her mother had been as skeptical as she now was. "How did you convince her?" "I didn't, really. She convinced herself by watching me, by testing me with difficult questions and impossible situations, by observing how I treated people who couldn't benefit me, servants, tenants, strangers. Your mother was one of the most intelligent people I've ever known, and she didn't trust words. She trusted actions, patterns, the truth that emerged over time." He smiled, and Arabella saw genuine warmth there for the first time in months. "Give the Duke the same chance. Watch him. Test him if you must. But don't reject the possibility of happiness simply because you're afraid of disappointment." The words stayed with her as she changed for the Duke's visit, this time into a proper afternoon dress of cream muslin with delicate embroidery at the hem. She looked like a respectable lady now. No hint of the maid's costume that had been yesterday's rebellion, yet she felt less herself in these fine clothes than she had in borrowed servant's garb. Vincent arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, driving himself in a curricle rather than arriving in a formal carriage with servants. It was another small detail that spoke volumes, a man comfortable with his own company, who didn't require constant attendance to maintain his sense of importance. This time Arabella was properly present in the drawing room when he was announced. She rose as he entered and felt that same jolt of awareness that had struck her yesterday. He was dressed less formally today, in riding clothes that suggested he had come directly from some outdoor activity, and there was colour in his cheeks that spoke of wind and exertion. "Miss Ravenscroft." He bowed over her hand with perfect propriety, but his eyes held amusement. "I confess I'm relieved to find you dressed as yourself today, though I did rather enjoy yesterday's performance." "Your Grace." She managed to keep her voice steady, despite the warmth spreading through her from where his fingers touched her glove. "I hope you can forgive my deception. It was childish and inappropriate." "It was honest and brave." He released her hand but held her gaze. "You wanted to see me as I actually am, without the performance we both put on for society. I respect that more than I can say." Her father had arranged to be absent, claiming business in the village with transparent convenience. A maid sat in the corner as chaperone, close enough to maintain propriety, but far enough to allow private conversation. Vincent settled into a chair with the ease of someone comfortable in any setting and gestured to the seat across from him. "I've been thinking about your condition," he said once she was seated. "About honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. So let me start by telling you something that might change your opinion of me entirely." Arabella felt her spine straighten with tension. Here it was, the revelation that would explain everything, the hidden flaw that made sense of why this seemingly perfect man remained unmarried. "I'm a bastard," Vincent said calmly, as though commenting on the weather. "Not figuratively, though. I've been called that often enough in business dealings. Literally. My mother was the daughter of a duke, but my father was her music teacher. When the pregnancy became impossible to hide, my grandfather forced her into a hasty marriage with a dying earl who gave me his name in exchange for a comfortable final year. He died when I was 3 months old, making me the Earl of Ashford despite my questionable parentage." The confession hung in the air between them. Arabella processed this information, watching Vincent's face for signs of shame or discomfort. She saw neither, only a kind of matter-of-fact acceptance of circumstance. "The ton doesn't know," she said, understanding immediately. "If they did, you would never have been accepted into society, title or not. My grandfather made sure the truth was buried along with everyone who knew it. The official story is that my mother and the Earl had a passionate but brief marriage before his untimely death. Only a handful of people know otherwise." Vincent leaned forward slightly. "I'm telling you because you asked for honesty, and because if we're to consider any kind of future together, you deserve to know what you'd be getting into. The truth is, my foundation is built on lies. My entire position in society is predicated on a fiction. If it ever came out, the scandal would destroy not just me, but anyone associated with me." Arabella sat very still, absorbing this revelation and all its implications. She should have been shocked, horrified, immediately reconsidering any involvement with a man whose legitimacy could be questioned. Instead, she found herself thinking about the unfairness of it all, how a child's worth was determined by circumstances of birth entirely beyond their control, how society's rigid rules could condemn someone for their parents' choices. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "You could have kept it secret. I would never have known. Because I meant what I said about partnership and honesty. Because I'm tired of the burden of secrets, and I think you might be one of the few people who would understand that." Vincent's grey eyes searched her face. "And because if you're going to reject me, I'd rather it be for the truth of who I am than a fiction I've maintained for appearance's sake." "I'm not going to reject you." The words emerged before Arabella had fully thought them through, but once spoken she realized they were true. "Your parents' choices aren't your fault. Your worth isn't determined by whether your mother wore a wedding ring when you were conceived. Anyone who would judge you for circumstances beyond your control isn't worth considering." Something in Vincent's expression shifted, a tension releasing that she hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "You're truly not bothered by this. Most women of your station would be horrified to learn they were courting the son of a music teacher. Most women of my station haven't written essays arguing that nobility of character matters more than nobility of birth." Arabella felt a smile tugging at her lips. "It would be rather hypocritical of me to reject you for the same arbitrary standards I've been criticizing in print. don't you think?" Vincent laughed, and the sound was rich with genuine relief and something that might have been joy. "You're extraordinary. Do you know that? Most people would have recoiled. You're sitting there telling me my questionable legitimacy doesn't matter while looking at me like I've passed some kind of test." "You have," Arabella admitted. "Honesty of that magnitude, vulnerability you didn't have to show, those are rare qualities. You could have courted me, married me, and I might never have learned the truth. The fact that you chose to tell me anyway says more about your character than your parentage ever could." They talked for hours after that, the conversation flowing with an ease that Arabella had never experienced with anyone outside her own family. Vincent asked about her writing, genuinely interested in her views on social reform and women's rights. She questioned him about his estates, his business ventures, the decisions he made that affected thousands of people. They debated philosophy and politics, discovered shared love of poetry and divergent opinions on Gothic novels, found themselves laughing over absurd social conventions they had both endured. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows when Vincent finally rose to leave, and Arabella was startled to realize how much time had passed. The maid in the corner had long since fallen asleep, her knitting abandoned in her lap. "I'd like to take you riding tomorrow," Vincent said as they walked to the door. "If you're agreeable, I want to show you something, and it requires getting away from houses and other people." "That sounds suspiciously like you're planning to compromise me in some secluded location," Arabella replied, but her tone was light, teasing. "I'm planning to show you my favorite place in Somerset and have a conversation without chaperones falling asleep or servants listening at doors." Vincent's smile held a challenge. "Unless you're afraid to be alone with me." "I'm not afraid of anything." The words came out more forcefully than intended, but Vincent didn't seem offended. "I know. It's one of your most attractive qualities." He left with plans to collect her at 9 the following morning. Arabella watched his curricle disappear down the lane, then turned to find her father hovering in the hallway with barely concealed curiosity. "Well?" "He's illegitimate," Arabella said, watching her father's face carefully. "Or technically legitimate because his mother married an earl before he was born, but his actual father was a commoner. The entire foundation of his position in society is built on a carefully maintained fiction." Lord Ravenscroft processed this information with visible effort. "And you're still willing to consider him?" "More than before, actually. He told me the truth when he could have kept it hidden forever. That kind of honesty is worth more than perfect bloodlines." Arabella moved past her father toward the stairs, pausing at the first step. "I think I might actually like him, Father, and that terrifies me far more than any scandal could." That evening, Arabella sat at her writing desk again, but this time the words flowed easily, observations and impressions spilling onto the page with unusual clarity. "He told me his greatest secret today, the truth that could destroy everything he's built. He did it because I asked for honesty, and he took me at my word. Either he's the most foolish man in England for trusting me with such dangerous information, or he's the most genuine. I find myself believing it's the latter, and I find myself wanting to trust him in return, to show him my own truths without the armor I've worn for so long. This is dangerous territory. This is how hearts get broken. But perhaps it's also how they get mended." The next morning dawned clear and perfect, as though nature itself was conspiring to make the day memorable. Arabella, dressed in her riding habit, dark blue velvet that had been her mother's, altered to fit her slightly taller frame. It was old-fashioned but well-made, and she refused to be embarrassed by the age of the garment. Vincent arrived exactly on time, leading a beautiful mare alongside his own stallion. "I took the liberty of bringing a horse from my stables. Your father mentioned your own mount had been sold some time ago." It was a kindness that acknowledged their financial difficulties without making her feel pitied. Arabella accepted his assistance mounting, hyper-aware of his hands at her waist, the strength in his grip, the warmth that seemed to radiate through layers of clothing. They rode in comfortable silence for a time, leaving the estate and following paths that led into wilder country. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn and approaching winter. Leaves crunched beneath the horses' hooves, and Arabella felt tension she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to ease from her shoulders. "Where are we going?" she asked finally, curiosity overcoming her contentment with the silence. "You'll see." Vincent glanced at her with a smile. "Patience has never been your strong suit, has it? Why should it be? Life is short, and wasting time waiting for things to unfold naturally has always seemed foolish when you could simply ask directly and get answers faster." A fair point. He guided his horse along a narrowing trail and she followed, though sometimes the journey matters as much as the destination. They rode for another 20 minutes, climbing gradually into hills that overlooked the valley below. Finally, Vincent drew his horse to a stop at the crest of a ridge, and Arabella pulled up beside him. The view was breathtaking. Somerset spread out beneath them in a patchwork of autumn colors, gold and amber, russet and brown, with the occasional deep green of evergreens punctuating the landscape. In the distance, she could see the spire of the village church, the silver ribbon of the river, the ancient stone bridge that had stood for centuries. "My mother used to bring me here," Vincent said quietly, his gaze on the horizon. "When I was a child and the weight of pretending to be something I wasn't became too heavy. She'd tell me that titles and bloodlines meant nothing compared to the view from this hill, that beauty and truth existed independent of society's judgment, that I could be myself here, even if I had to wear a mask everywhere else." Arabella heard the emotion beneath his words, the hint of a lonely child seeking refuge from a world that would have rejected him if it knew his truth. She thought of her own childhood, privileged in so many ways, yet constrained by expectations that chafed against her natural inclinations. "She must have been a remarkable woman," Arabella said softly. "She was. She died 5 years ago." Vincent's voice caught slightly. "Pneumonia. She was gone within a week, and I never got to tell her that I understood what she was trying to teach me, that the person I am when I'm alone, when no one is watching and judging, that's who really matters." Without thinking about propriety or consequences, Arabella reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his saddle. The gesture was small but significant, a bridge across the space between them. "She knew," Arabella said with certainty. "Parents always know when their children understand them. She knew you heard her even if you never spoke the words." They sat in silence for a long moment, hands touching, looking out over the valley that spread beneath them. Arabella felt something shifting inside her, the careful walls she had built crumbling under the assault of genuine connection and shared understanding. "I want to show you something too," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the impulse. "Something I've never shown anyone." They rode back toward Ravenscroft Manor, but veered off before reaching it, following a path Arabella had worn herself over years of solitary walks. It led to a small structure hidden among overgrown gardens, a folly her grandfather had built decades ago, designed to look like a crumbling Roman temple, but actually quite sound beneath its artistic decay. "This is my writing place," Arabella said as she dismounted. "Where I come when I need to think without interruption or judgment, where I wrote that essay you read, and every other piece I've published under initials or anonymously." Vincent dismounted and followed her into the folly, ducking slightly to pass through the entrance designed more for aesthetics than practicality. Inside, the space was surprisingly comfortable. A worn chair sat beside a makeshift desk, constructed from an old door and 2 barrels. Books lined shelves that had been salvaged from somewhere, their spines cracked with frequent reading. Papers covered every surface, some carefully stacked, others scattered as though abandoned mid-thought. "This is wonderful," Vincent said, and she heard genuine appreciation in his voice. He moved carefully through the space, examining titles without touching anything, respecting the sanctity of her private retreat. "A room of one's own. Virginia Woolf would approve." "You've read her essays?" Arabella was surprised despite herself. Most men dismissed women writers entirely, let alone read their critical work. "I read everything I can find that challenges conventional thinking. Woolf, Wollstonecraft, even some of the more radical French philosophers my tutors insisted would corrupt my morals." Vincent turned to face her, and in the dim light filtering through the folly's crumbling walls, his expression was serious. "I wasn't exaggerating yesterday when I said I wanted a partner who could match me intellectually. I've spent my entire life pretending to be someone I'm not in public. I refuse to spend my private life doing the same." Arabella felt her heartbeat accelerate. They were alone here, truly alone, with no servants or chaperones, no social expectations or watching eyes. It was improper and dangerous, and exactly where she wanted to be. "Why me?" The question emerged raw and vulnerable. "You could have any woman in England. Women with impeccable breeding, substantial dowries, connections that would benefit you politically and socially. Why pursue someone whose family is ruined, whose reputation is questionable, whose opinions make her unmarriageable by conventional standards?" Vincent crossed the space between them in 2 strides, stopping close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, could smell the combination of leather and wind that clung to him. "Because every other woman I've met has been trying to become what she thinks I want. You're the only one who dared to be exactly who you are. Consequences be damned." His voice dropped lower, intimate in a way that made her skin prickle with awareness. "Because you served me tea dressed as a maid, rather than perform for me like a trained dog. Because you write brilliantly about subjects women aren't supposed to understand and publish them despite knowing the scandal it could cause. Because when I told you I'm illegitimate, you didn't recoil in horror but argued that it makes me more interesting rather than less. Those are all reasons I'm completely inappropriate for someone of your position," Arabella managed, though her voice sounded breathless even to her own ears. "Those are all reasons you're perfect for someone of my actual character rather than my supposed position." Vincent raised his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and cupped her cheek with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. "I don't want appropriate, Arabella. I want real. I want you." The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable and shocking in equal measure. His lips met hers with careful tenderness, asking rather than demanding, waiting for her response before deepening the contact. Arabella's hands came up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself as the world tilted and reformed around this single point of connection. She had been kissed before, stolen moments at balls with boys who thought themselves dashing, awkward encounters that taught her kissing was generally overrated as a romantic gesture. This was nothing like those fumbling experiences. This was heat and hunger tempered with patience, desire matched with respect, a conversation conducted without words but full of meaning. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I should apologize," he said, though he didn't sound particularly sorry. "That was completely improper." "Good." Arabella surprised herself with the word, with the fierce joy flooding through her. "I'm tired of propriety, tired of pretending I don't want things I'm not supposed to want, tired of being told that passion and intelligence can't coexist in a respectable woman. Then marry me." The proposal emerged urgent and earnest, without the formal preparation society would expect. "Not because your father needs rescue or because I'm a good match on paper. Marry me because we could be extraordinary together, because I want to wake up next to someone who challenges me and excites me and makes me grateful to be alive. Because you're the only woman I've ever met who makes me want to be honest instead of convenient." Arabella pulled back enough to see his face clearly, to search those grey eyes for any hint of deception or doubt. She found neither, only intensity and hope, and something that looked remarkably like the emotions churning through her own chest. "I need time," she said, and saw disappointment flash across his features before he controlled it. "Not because I doubt you, because this is happening so fast, and I need to be sure I'm choosing from desire rather than desperation. You offered me weeks to get to know you. I'm asking for that time. Let me be certain that what I'm feeling is real, and not just relief that someone finally sees me as I actually am." Vincent stepped back, giving her space, and she saw understanding replace disappointment. "You're right. I'm rushing because I've waited so long for this that now it's here. I want to seize it immediately, but you deserve time to be certain, so take it. Ask me anything. Test me however you need. I'll prove myself worthy of your trust, however long that takes." They rode back to Ravenscroft Manor in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet now, charged with possibility rather than awkward with uncertainty. When they reached the house, Vincent helped her dismount with perfect propriety, as though they hadn't just kissed in a hidden folly like characters from a scandalous novel. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked formally, for the benefit of any servants who might be watching. I'd like that. Arabella felt herself smiling, unable to suppress the expression even though it probably revealed too much. Perhaps we could discuss your views on property reform. I've been researching inheritance laws, and I have some questions about primogeniture. Vincent's answering smile was brilliant. Most women want to discuss fashion or gossip. You want to debate legal reform. Most women are boring. Arabella turned toward the house, then paused and looked back at him. For what it's worth, Your Grace, I think my answer will be yes. I just need to arrive at that conclusion myself, rather than having it chosen for me by circumstance or pressure. Take all the time you need. Vincent mounted his horse with easy grace. I've waited 32 years to find you. I can wait a few weeks more to make you my Duchess. He rode off, and Arabella stood watching until he disappeared from view. Her lips still tingled from their kiss. Her mind raced with implications and possibilities. Her heart, that organ she had thought safely armored against romantic foolishness, beat with an erratic rhythm that suggested it had ideas of its own. Her father met her at the door with barely concealed curiosity, but for once she didn't feel like sharing her thoughts. She needed to process what had happened, to examine her feelings with the same careful analysis she would apply to any important decision. This wasn't just about marriage or financial rescue. This was about the rest of her life, about choosing a partner who would shape her future in profound ways. That night, she wrote in her journal with shaking hands, "He kissed me today." More accurately, we kissed each other, and it was nothing like I expected. Everything actually was nothing like I expected. I thought I would meet him and find reasons to refuse. Instead, I'm finding reasons to accept. He's illegitimate, which should matter and somehow doesn't. He's wildly inappropriate for me, which makes him perfect. He wants me to be myself rather than a polished version designed to please society. He sees me, really sees me, and he likes what he sees. I think I might be falling in love with him, and that terrifies me more than anything I've ever faced. Because if I'm wrong about him, if this is all performance and his true nature emerges after we're bound together, I won't recover. I've spent my whole life protecting myself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. But protecting myself has also meant living behind walls, never risking enough to gain anything worth having. Mother always said that love requires courage. I'm beginning to understand what she meant. The following weeks passed in a blur of visits and conversations, rides through the countryside and debates in drawing rooms. Vincent was unfailingly honest, sometimes brutally so, sharing aspects of his life and character that many men would have hidden. He told her about business dealings that had required ruthless decisions, about tenants he'd evicted for non-payment despite their circumstances, about political maneuvering that contradicted his stated principles. "I'm not perfect," he said during one particularly frank discussion. "I've made decisions I'm not proud of, compromised in ways that haunt me. I want you to know the worst of me before you commit to anything." Arabella appreciated this honesty, even as some of his revelations troubled her. She pushed back against his justifications, challenged his reasoning, refused to simply accept his explanations when she found them lacking. And Vincent seemed to relish these debates, growing animated and engaged in ways that suggested he had been starving for exactly this kind of intellectual sparring. She introduced him to her writing, showing him essays she had published and others she kept private for being too radical, even for anonymous publication. He read them all with careful attention, offering thoughtful critique that improved her arguments rather than dismissing them. He connected her with his own publishers, opening doors that had been firmly closed to a woman writer. "You're making me dangerous," Arabella said, after he arranged for one of her more controversial pieces to be published in a respected journal. "Once I have a platform, I'll use it. I won't suddenly become moderate and acceptable just because I'm a duchess." "Good." Vincent took her hand, a gesture that had become comfortable through repetition. "The world needs more dangerous women. Polite silence has never changed anything worth changing." They visited his estate in Northumberland, a journey that required 3 days of travel and raised eyebrows across Somerset. Arabella's father accompanied them as chaperone, but the trip allowed her to see Vincent in his own environment, to observe how he interacted with people who depended on him. What she saw impressed her. Vincent knew his tenants by name, understood their individual circumstances, made decisions based on long-term sustainability rather than short-term profit. He consulted with farmers about crop rotation and invested in improvements that benefited the land as much as his income. His steward clearly respected him, and the estate workers spoke of him with genuine regard rather than fearful compliance. "You're a better landlord than most," Arabella observed as they rode through fields being prepared for winter planting. "I expected arrogance from someone of your wealth and position. Instead, I find pragmatism and actual concern for the people who work your land." "My grandfather was a tyrant who treated people as interchangeable resources," Vincent replied. "I saw the damage that caused, the resentment it bred, the inefficiency it created. Treating people well isn't just morally right, it's good business. Happy tenants are productive tenants. Respected workers are loyal workers. It's not complicated, though apparently most of my class hasn't figured it out yet." They were standing in the estate's library when Vincent showed her his mother's journals, leather-bound volumes that documented her thoughts across 30 years. "I want you to read these," he said, handing her the first volume with obvious emotion. She was brilliant and trapped, married to a dying man to preserve a secret, never able to pursue her own passions because society wouldn't allow it. "I don't want that for us. I don't want you to feel trapped or limited or forced to hide who you are." Arabella spent 2 days reading those journals, finding in them a kindred spirit, separated by a generation. Vincent's mother had been a gifted musician, a skilled linguist, a woman of fierce intellect, forced to channel all her talents into the acceptable outlets of household management and child rearing. The sadness that permeated the later entries broke Arabella's heart, even as the earlier ones inspired her. "She would have loved you," Vincent said when Arabella returned the journals. "She always hoped I would find someone who wouldn't require me to pretend, someone who could be a true partner rather than an ornament. I hope I can be that." Arabella felt tears threatening and didn't bother to hide them. "Your mother deserved better than the life she was allowed. I want to honor her memory by being someone worthy of what you're offering." The proposal, when it finally came officially, happened without fanfare or elaborate planning. They were back at Arabella's Folly, discussing her latest essay on voting reform, when Vincent suddenly stopped mid-sentence and pulled a ring from his pocket. "This was my mother's," he said, holding out a band of gold set with a single perfect emerald. "Her father gave it to her when she turned 21, before everything went wrong. She left it to me with instructions to give it to someone who would appreciate both its beauty and its history, someone who understood that the most valuable things are often those that carry complicated stories." Arabella looked at the ring, then at Vincent's face, seeing hope and vulnerability in equal measure. She thought about the past weeks, about everything she had learned, about the life he was offering, and the woman she could be with him beside her. "Yes," she said simply, "not because my family needs rescue, or because you're the Duke of Ashford. Because I want to spend my life arguing with you about politics and reading your correspondence and challenging you to be better than you think you can be. Because you've shown me that partnership isn't a fairy tale but an actual possibility. Because I love you." The words emerged more easily than she expected, and she saw Vincent's face transform with joy that made him look younger and more carefree than she had yet seen him. "You love me," he repeated, as though testing the reality of the statement. "Even knowing everything you know about me, the illegitimacy, the ruthlessness, the flaws I've been cataloging for weeks, you love me anyway. Especially knowing all that." Arabella let him slide the ring onto her finger, feeling the weight of it settle with rightness that defied logic. "Perfect people are boring. You're interesting and complicated and sometimes infuriating. You're exactly what I need." The kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper, more certain, flavored with promise and commitment. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling with the giddy joy of people who had gambled on happiness and won. "We're going to scandalize society," Vincent said, his arms still around her waist. "A duchess who publishes radical essays and argues with politicians. A duke who actually respects his wife's intelligence. People won't know what to make of us." "Good," Arabella replied. "Let them be scandalized. We'll be too busy being happy to care what they think." They returned to Ravenscroft Manor to share the news with her father, who wept with relief and joy in equal measure. Letters were dispatched to her sisters, who responded with congratulations that couldn't quite hide their astonishment that their difficult youngest sister had somehow landed the catch of the century. Plans were made for a wedding that would be modest by ducal standards, but perfect by Arabella's. A private ceremony in the estate chapel, followed by a celebration for tenants and neighbors that emphasized community over ostentation. The weeks leading to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations and revelations. Arabella learned that Vincent played piano beautifully, a skill inherited from his father and practiced in private because society would have found it odd for a duke to possess such talent. She discovered his dry sense of humor, his tendency to work too late into the night, his surprising skill at chess, and his complete inability to dance anything more complicated than a basic waltz. "We'll be terrible at balls," she said after he stepped on her feet for the third time during a practice session. "Then we won't go to many balls." Vincent pulled her closer, despite the shocked protest from the dance master her father had hired. "We'll stay home and read and argue and do all the things that actually matter. Let society manage without us." The wedding day arrived with autumn in full glory, the trees surrounding the chapel ablaze with color that seemed designed to celebrate their union. Arabella wore her mother's wedding dress, altered and updated, but carrying the history of a love match that had defied convention. Vincent stood at the altar looking simultaneously terrified and ecstatic, and when he saw her walking toward him, his expression made her heart clench with fierce protectiveness. The ceremony was simple and profound, words spoken with meaning rather than mere ritual. When the vicar pronounced them married, Vincent kissed her with such tenderness that several guests openly wept. They emerged from the chapel to cheers from assembled tenants and neighbors, to sunshine that felt like benediction, to a future that stretched ahead with possibility rather than constraint. The celebration that followed was unlike any wedding breakfast society had seen. Instead of formal courses served in stuffy silence, long tables were set up in the garden, where tenants and gentry mingled with surprising ease. Music played, not a stiff orchestra, but local musicians who knew songs people actually wanted to hear. Children ran wild among the flowers, and Vincent danced with tenant farmers' daughters with the same courtesy he showed to titled ladies. "This is perfect," Arabella said, watching her new husband laugh at some joke shared with an elderly groundskeeper. "Exactly what I wanted without knowing I wanted it." Eleanor, her eldest sister, appeared at her elbow with champagne and a complicated expression. "I'm happy for you, truly. But I confess I don't understand how you managed it. You broke every rule, defied every convention, and somehow ended up with the most eligible bachelor in England genuinely in love with you. I stopped trying to be what people expected and started being who I actually am," Arabella replied. Apparently that's what he was looking for all along. Still, Eleanor shook her head in bemused admiration. "Serving him tea dressed as a maid. I can't believe that worked." "Neither can I." Arabella caught Vincent's eye across the crowd, and he smiled at her with such warmth that she felt it like physical touch. But apparently, sometimes the most ridiculous risks lead to the best outcomes. As the sun set and the celebration continued into evening, Vincent found her standing apart from the crowd, looking out over the estate that was now partially hers. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder in a gesture of easy intimacy that still felt new and wonderful. "Happy?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted, "and happier than I've ever been. And convinced I'm about to wake up and discover this was all a dream." "Not a dream." Vincent turned her to face him, his grey eyes serious in the fading light. "A partnership, an adventure, a choice we both made to be brave enough to be real with each other. That's rarer and more valuable than any fairy tale." They stood together as twilight deepened tonight, surrounded by the sounds of celebration, but existing in their own private moment of understanding. Arabella thought about the girl she had been weeks ago, so certain that marriage meant surrender, that choosing a partner required compromising herself. She had been wrong, though discovering that had required finding someone unusual enough to appreciate what made her different. "I love you," she said, still marveling at how easily the words came now. "I'm going to spend the rest of our lives challenging you and arguing with you and making you question everything you think you know. I hope you're prepared." I'm counting on it. Vincent kissed her softly, then grinned. Besides, I have plans to challenge you right back. We're going to make each other better, stronger, more fully ourselves than we could ever be alone. That's what partnership means. The first months of marriage were an education in ways Arabella had never anticipated. She had expected adjustment, the awkward negotiation of shared space and competing habits. What she hadn't expected was the profound joy of being truly known by another person, of having a partner who engaged with her thoughts as seriously as she engaged with his. They settled into Vincent's London townhouse initially, a compromise between her desire for country solitude and the practical necessity of managing his business interests and parliamentary duties. The house was beautiful, but had been decorated with the sterile perfection of someone who had never really lived in it. Within weeks, Arabella had transformed it into a space that felt lived in and real. Books overflowing from shelves, her writing materials claiming a corner of Vincent's study, comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than display. "My steward is scandalized," Vincent said one evening, watching her reorganize his library to combine their collections. "He says a duchess shouldn't be moving furniture and climbing ladders herself. Your steward can manage his own house however he likes." Arabella shelved another volume, this one a radical political treatise that would have horrified half of London's society if they knew it sat beside histories of the peerage. "This is our home. It should reflect who we actually are, not who we're supposed to be." Vincent moved to steady the ladder as she reached for a high shelf. He also mentioned that several ladies have called and you've been unavailable to receive them, because they want to gossip and judge and evaluate how well I'm performing the role of Duchess. I have better things to do with my time. Arabella descended the ladder with a stack of books that needed proper homes. "I'm finishing that essay on factory conditions. The editor wants it by Friday. You're going to make enemies." Vincent's tone held warning but not criticism. "Publishing political work as a duchess rather than anonymously, people will talk, some will be hostile. Let them." Arabella faced him with the determination that had carried her through years of social pressure. "I didn't marry you to become invisible or acceptable. You said you wanted a partner who wouldn't hide her intelligence or moderate her opinions. Well, this is who I am. If society can't handle a duchess with actual thoughts, that's society's problem, not mine." Vincent pulled her close, books and all, and kissed her with the passion that still surprised her with its intensity. "Have I mentioned lately that I'm wildly in love with you?" "Not in the last hour." Arabella smiled against his lips. "You're getting neglectful." Domestic happiness aside, Arabella quickly discovered that being a duchess came with expectations that ranged from tedious to infuriating. She was expected to host elaborate dinners, to visit and be visited by other titled ladies, to concern herself with fashion and furnishings, and the thousand trivial details that apparently occupied women of her station. The assumption that marriage would somehow transform her into someone different, someone properly conventional, was both insulting and exhausting. The first major social event they hosted as a married couple was a dinner for several of Vincent's parliamentary colleagues and their wives. Arabella spent the week beforehand researching the pending trade legislation they would be discussing, preparing arguments and questions that would move the conversation beyond polite inanity. Mrs. Pemberton, the wife of one of Vincent's political allies, arrived with the obvious intention of taking Arabella under her wing. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, dressed with perfect propriety, who had clearly appointed herself as guide to the newest Duchess. "My dear Lady Ashford," she said, with the kind of condescension disguised as kindness, "you'll want to make sure the ladies withdraw after dinner promptly. We'll leave the gentlemen to their politics and discuss more suitable topics in the drawing room." "Actually," Arabella replied with studied pleasantness, "I was hoping to participate in the discussion about the Corn Laws. I've been reading about import tariffs and their effect on domestic grain prices, and I have some questions about the proposed reforms." Mrs. Pemberton's smile froze in place. "How unusual, though I'm sure you'll find ladies' conversation more comfortable. Politics can be so dreary and complicated." "I find politics fascinating and less complicated than people pretend." Arabella excused herself before the conversation could continue, already tired of pretense and performance. The dinner itself was both success and disaster, depending on perspective. The food was excellent, the wine carefully selected, the service impeccable, but when the ladies were expected to withdraw, Arabella remained seated, looking expectantly at Vincent, as though waiting for the real conversation to begin. "The Duchess is interested in the trade legislation," Vincent said smoothly, addressing the table at large. "I've been curious about her perspective, actually. She has insights the rest of us might be missing." The discomfort was palpable. Several of the wives looked scandalized. The gentleman appeared uncertain how to proceed, but Lord Pemberton, to his credit, recovered quickly and addressed Arabella directly. "What aspects of the legislation interest you, Lady Ashford?" "The tariff structure seems designed to protect landowners at the expense of urban workers," Arabella said, grateful for the opening. "Keeping grain prices artificially high benefits those of us with estates, but forces labourers to spend disproportionate income on basic food. I'm curious how you justify that outcome while claiming to represent the nation's interests." The debate that followed was spirited and sometimes heated. Arabella held her own against men who had decades of parliamentary experience, citing specific provisions and economic data that made it clear she had done her research. Some of the gentlemen were impressed. Others were visibly irritated at being challenged by a woman. All of them left with the clear understanding that the new Duchess of Ashford was not going to conform to their expectations. After the guests departed, Vincent found Arabella in his study, still energized from the evening's discussions. "Mrs. Pemberton told me you were inappropriately forward at dinner. Lord Hartley said you were brilliant. Lord Simmons muttered something about women forgetting their place." He poured them both brandy, a shared indulgence they had adopted. "I believe we've successfully scandalized everyone, except Lord Pemberton." Arabella accepted the glass, savoring the burn of quality spirits. "He actually engaged with my arguments rather than dismissing them because of my gender. I like him." "So do I, which is why I warned him in advance that you would probably participate in the discussion." Vincent settled into the chair beside hers, looking satisfied despite the evening's social complications. "The others will either adjust or stop accepting our invitations. Either outcome is acceptable." "You're not worried about damaging your political standing?" Arabella studied his face, looking for signs of regret or frustration. "Having a wife who insists on speaking her mind can't help your career." "My career can survive some social friction. My marriage wouldn't survive you pretending to be someone you're not." Vincent reached over to take her hand, a gesture that had become habitual. "Besides, Lord Pemberton told me privately that his own wife is brilliant, but has learned to hide it for the sake of his career. He said he envies me for having a partner who won't do the same. I think we might be inspiring some uncomfortable conversations in other households." The weeks that followed confirmed that their unconventional approach to ducal life was indeed causing ripples. Some doors closed, invitations stopped arriving from the most conservative elements of society, and certain ladies made clear that Arabella's company was not desired. But other doors opened. Younger couples sought them out, curious about a marriage that seemed to defy convention. Intellectuals who had avoided social obligations found reasons to attend gatherings at the Ashford townhouse. Writers and reformers discovered in Arabella an aristocratic ally who could provide access to circles typically closed to them. The essay on factory conditions was published under her full name and title, causing exactly the scandal she had anticipated. Several newspapers published editorials decrying a duchess involving herself in matters unsuitable for her sex and station. But others praised her courage and the quality of her arguments. Most significantly, the essay reached people who would never have encountered it had it been published anonymously, and it sparked genuine discussion about labor reform. "You're becoming famous," Vincent observed one morning over breakfast, reading through the latest pile of correspondence. "Or infamous, depending on who's doing the talking. This letter is from a workers' collective in Manchester, thanking you for giving voice to their concerns. This one is from Lady Hartwell, informing us that we are no longer welcome at her annual ball." Excellent. Arabella was drafting her next essay, this one on education reform. "Lady Hartwell's balls are tedious anyway." And the letter from Manchester is worth 100 invitations from disapproving aristocrats. She paused, pen hovering over paper as a thought occurred to her. Do you ever regret it? Marrying someone who makes your life more complicated rather than easier? Vincent set down the letters and came around the table to stand behind her chair, his hands settling on her shoulders with comfortable familiarity. Never. Not once. Not even when I'm being lectured by elderly peers about controlling my wife's unseemly public pronouncements. He leaned down to press a kiss to the top of her head. You make my life more interesting, more meaningful, more worth living. That's worth any amount of social complication. The session in Parliament that autumn brought new challenges and opportunities. Vincent was deeply involved in reform legislation, and Arabella found herself in the unusual position of being a duchess who actually understood and cared about the political maneuvering. She attended sessions when permitted, sitting in the gallery with other women, but taking notes with the focus of someone planning to use the information. You realize you're making the other wives uncomfortable, Eleanor told her during one such session. She had come to London for the season and was staying with Arabella and Vincent. They're supposed to be here for show, to demonstrate that their husbands have proper family support. They're not supposed to actually pay attention to the proceedings. Then they're wasting their time. Arabella continued her note-taking, tracking a particularly complex debate about mining regulations. If I'm going to sit in an uncomfortable seat for hours, I'm at least going to learn something useful. Eleanor watched her younger sister with a mixture of admiration and concern. You've changed since marrying the Duke. You're bolder, more certain of yourself. But you're also making powerful enemies. Lady Markham was saying just yesterday that you're a dangerous influence on younger women, giving them inappropriate ideas about their place in society. Good. Arabella looked up from her notes, meeting her sister's worried gaze directly. Society's ideas about women's place need to change. If I can help accelerate that process, why wouldn't I? I have advantages most women don't. Education, financial security, a husband who supports rather than suppresses my work. It would be wasteful not to use those advantages for something meaningful. I worry about you, Eleanor said softly, about the toll this constant fighting takes. You could have an easier life if you were willing to compromise just a little. Compromise how? By pretending to be stupid? By hiding my intelligence to make small-minded people comfortable? By accepting injustice because challenging it is inconvenient? Arabella shook her head firmly. I spent years doing exactly that, Eleanor. Making myself smaller and quieter and more acceptable, and I was miserable. I'd rather be scandalous and honest than respected and false. That evening, Arabella shared the conversation with Vincent as they prepared for bed. He listened thoughtfully while removing his cufflinks with the careful attention he brought to even small tasks. Your sister loves you and wants to protect you, he said finally. But she's also trapped in her own compromises. Married to a man she respects but doesn't love. Playing a role she finds stifling. Watching you live the kind of life she wishes she had chosen. Her concern comes partially from care and partially from envy. I know. Arabella sat at her dressing table, removing the pins from her hair with practiced efficiency. Sometimes I feel guilty about being happy when she's not, as though I don't deserve this freedom simply because I was stubborn enough to wait for it. Vincent came to stand behind her, taking over the task of unpinning her hair with gentle hands. You deserve it because you refused to settle for less than you needed. Eleanor made different choices, ones she thought were right at the time. You're not responsible for her regrets. They stood in comfortable silence while he finished with her hair, his fingers running through the dark waves with obvious pleasure. Arabella watched him in the mirror, still marveling at the reality of their partnership. 6 months into marriage, and she continued to discover new layers to the man she had chosen. I've been thinking, Vincent said, his hands settling on her shoulders, about using our position more strategically. We have access and influence that could benefit causes we care about. What if we hosted salons, regular gatherings, where reformers and intellectuals could meet with sympathetic aristocrats and politicians? We could facilitate connections and conversations that might actually lead to meaningful change. Arabella turned to face him, excitement kindling in her chest. That's brilliant. We'd be scandalous hosts, But we're already scandalous. We might as well make the scandal productive. Exactly. Vincent pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her waist. We'll be strategic about it. Invite the right mix of people, make sure conversations happen that wouldn't occur otherwise. Use our social capital for something more valuable than maintaining social position. They began planning that night, mapping out potential guests and topics, identifying allies, and determining how to navigate the complex politics of bringing together people who wouldn't normally occupy the same rooms. It was the kind of project that utilized both their skills, her intellectual network and his political connections, her passion for reform and his pragmatic understanding of how change actually happened in aristocratic circles. The first salon was held on a wet November evening, bringing together an unlikely mix of poets and politicians, factory reformers and financiers, suffragists and sympathetic lords. Arabella had worried that the conversation would be stilted, or that the social differences would prove too great to bridge. Instead, the evening crackled with energy and intellectual excitement. She found herself deep in discussion with a radical journalist and a surprisingly progressive marquis about property rights and inheritance law. Vincent was across the room, mediating a spirited debate between a mine owner and a workers' advocate about safety regulations. Everywhere she looked, people were talking, really talking, engaging with ideas and arguments rather than simply exchanging pleasantries. "This is extraordinary," said Catherine Morrison, a writer Arabella had long admired but never met. "I've attended dozens of literary salons and political gatherings, but I've never seen aristocrats and reformers actually listening to each other like this. How did you manage it?" "By making it clear that pretense and posturing weren't welcome." Arabella watched Vincent across the room, saw him laugh at something his conversation partner said, felt warmth spreading through her chest. "We set ground rules. Ideas matter more than titles. Arguments should be based on evidence rather than assertion, and everyone gets heard regardless of their social position. Then we invited people brave enough or curious enough to show up." "Your husband is unusual," Catherine observed, following Arabella's gaze. "Most men of his station would be horrified by the company you're keeping. He seems genuinely engaged." "He is unusual." Arabella felt a smile tugging at her lips. "That's why I married him." The salons became a regular occurrence, growing in attendance and reputation. They also increased the social price Arabella and Vincent paid. Invitations from the most conservative elements of society stopped entirely. Rumors circulated about the dangerous radicals being entertained at the Ashford townhouse. One particularly vitriolic newspaper editorial suggested that the Duke had been bewitched by his inappropriate wife and needed intervention before his political career was completely destroyed. "They're calling you a seductress who has corrupted me," Vincent said with amusement, reading the article in question. "Apparently, I was a respectable pillar of society until you came along with your dangerous ideas and scandalous behavior." "Should I apologize for corrupting you?" Arabella asked, not bothering to hide her own smile. "Absolutely not. Please continue corrupting me at every opportunity." But not everyone was amused. Lord Simmons, one of Vincent's former allies, confronted him in the corridors of Parliament with accusations that bordered on threats. "You're destroying your credibility," Simmons hissed, loud enough for nearby peers to hear. "Housing radicals and reformers under your roof, allowing your wife to publish political essays under your name, behaving as though social order doesn't matter. You're making enemies of people you need as friends." "Then perhaps I was friends with the wrong people." Vincent's voice remained calm, but carried an edge that made several observers step back. "My wife has every right to her opinions and her work. My home is my own, and I'll invite whomever I choose. And if that offends you, Lord Simmons, you're welcome to withdraw your friendship." The confrontation became the talk of Parliament and drawing rooms across London. Opinions divided sharply. Some praised Vincent for standing by his wife. Others condemned him for allowing himself to be manipulated by a woman with inappropriate ambitions. The controversy reached such intensity that even supporters suggested Vincent might need to moderate his household's activities for the sake of his political future. Arabella felt the weight of this pressure acutely. She hadn't intended to damage Vincent's career, hadn't fully considered how her choices would affect his position. One evening, After a particularly difficult day where Vincent had lost a critical vote in Parliament, she found herself questioning whether her principles were worth the cost they were exacting. "Perhaps I should stop," she said quietly, sitting in Vincent's study while he worked through correspondence. "The essays, the salons, the public positions. Perhaps I should behave more like a conventional duchess so your work doesn't suffer." Vincent looked up sharply, his grey eyes intense. "Is that what you want?" "Of course not, but I don't want to destroy everything you've built either. You worked for years to establish yourself in Parliament, to be taken seriously despite your youth. I've been married to you less than a year, and I'm unravelling all of that." "No." Vincent set down his pen and came around the desk to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "They're unravelling it because they can't handle a marriage where both partners are equals, because they're threatened by a woman who won't play by their arbitrary rules, because they'd rather maintain a system that benefits them than adapt to necessary change. But your political work matters. The legislation you're trying to pass would help thousands of people. If I'm preventing that from happening, then the problem is with them, not with you." Vincent's grip tightened on her hands. "Listen to me, Arabella. I could have married any conventional woman and maintained my political standing easily. I chose you because I wanted a partner, not an ornament. Because I believed, I still believe, that having you beside me makes me better, stronger, more capable of doing meaningful work. If Parliament can't handle that, if society can't adapt, then they're the ones who need to change, not us. You might lose your seat." Arabella felt tears threatening and fought them back. "All because I can't keep my opinions to myself. Then I'll lose it fighting for something I believe in, rather than keeping it through cowardly compromise. And I'll still have you, which matters infinitely more." Vincent stood, pulling her up with him and into his arms. "We're partners, remember? We face consequences together, and we don't apologize for being who we are. That's not negotiable." The conviction in his voice, the absolute certainty that they were right and their critics wrong, steadied something inside Arabella that had been wavering. She clung to him, grateful beyond words for a husband who saw her fears and met them with strength rather than resentment. "I love you," she whispered into his shoulder, "even when I'm terrified that loving you means hurting you. You've never hurt me. You've challenged me, inspired me, occasionally infuriated me, but never hurt me." Vincent pulled back enough to see her face, using his thumbs to wipe away tears she hadn't realized had fallen. "We're going to be fine. Better than fine. We're going to change things, slowly and steadily, simply by refusing to pretend we're something we're not." Winter settled over London with unusual severity, bringing snow that turned the city beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. The social season slowed, giving Arabella and Vincent breathing room from constant scrutiny. They spent evenings by the fire, reading to each other and debating points of philosophy and politics, falling into comfortable routines that felt simultaneously domestic and intellectually stimulating. Arabella's writing flourished during these quieter months. She completed a series of essays on women's education that were published in a progressive journal and received surprising support from unexpected quarters. Several prominent women wrote to thank her for articulating arguments they had felt but couldn't express. A few progressive men cited her work in parliamentary speeches, giving her ideas reach beyond what she could achieve through writing alone. "You're becoming influential," Vincent observed one evening, reading through responses to her latest publication. "People are starting to take these arguments seriously because you're making them impossible to dismiss." "Because I have the protection of your title and position," Arabella corrected. "Any other woman making the same arguments would be ignored or ridiculed. I'm only heard because I'm a duchess." "Then use that advantage for all it's worth." Vincent looked up from the letters. "You didn't choose to be born into privilege, but you have it. Make it count for something beyond personal comfort." It was a philosophy they both embraced, using their resources and position to amplify voices that would otherwise go unheard. The salons continued through winter, growing in both attendance and impact. Connections formed in the Ashford townhouse led to unlikely collaborations. A factory owner, implementing better working conditions after conversations with labor advocates. a journalist gaining access to parliamentary proceedings through Vincent's influence, a women's education initiative receiving funding from sympathetic aristocrats who had been convinced by Arabella's arguments. They weren't changing the world overnight, but they were shifting it incrementally, creating spaces where change became possible. And they were doing it together, each bringing skills and perspectives that complemented the others. Spring arrived with sudden warmth and the return of London's full social calendar. Arabella discovered she was pregnant in March, a revelation that brought both joy and complicated new considerations. She told Vincent one morning at breakfast, watching his face cycle through shock, delight, and immediate concern. "Are you happy about this?" he asked carefully, coming to kneel beside her chair in what had become his characteristic position for important conversations. "We never discussed children explicitly. I should have asked what you wanted before assuming I'm happy." Arabella took his hand and placed it over her still flat abdomen. "Terrified and uncertain and worried about how this will change things, but happy, are you?" "Ecstatic." Vincent's smile was brilliant, unguarded in a way he rarely allowed in public. "Though also terrified. What if I'm a terrible father? What if I pass on my worst qualities instead of my best ones? Then we'll raise a child who is intelligently difficult rather than mindlessly obedient. And that's not a bad outcome." Arabella leaned forward to kiss him softly. "We'll figure it out together, just like everything else." Pregnancy brought unexpected challenges beyond the physical discomforts. Society expected her to withdraw from public life, to focus entirely on the sacred duty of producing an heir, to stop her scandalous activities and behave like a proper expectant duchess. Arabella had no intention of complying with these expectations. She continued writing, though morning sickness made early hours difficult. She still hosted salons, though she sometimes had to excuse herself when fatigue became overwhelming. She attended Parliament when she felt well enough, taking notes that would inform future essays. And she refused to treat pregnancy as an illness, requiring complete withdrawal from meaningful activity. "You're being reckless," her sister Eleanor warned during a visit. "The baby's health should be your priority. All this running around, these late nights hosting radical gatherings, the stress of constant controversy, it can't be good for the child." "The baby is perfectly healthy according to the midwife," Arabella replied with forced patience. "And I refuse to believe that using my mind somehow endangers pregnancy. Women have been doing important work while carrying children since the beginning of humanity. I'm not fragile simply because I'm pregnant." But she did make some concessions as her pregnancy progressed. The essays became shorter, more focused, the salons less frequent. She accepted that her body needed rest even as her mind remained active. Vincent became fiercely protective, hovering in ways that were simultaneously touching and irritating. "I'm not made of glass," she told him, after he physically prevented her from climbing a ladder to reach a book on a high shelf. "I know, but you're carrying something infinitely precious, and I'm going to do everything in my power to keep both of you safe." Vincent's hand settled over her swelling abdomen with gentle possessiveness. "Humor me. Let me take care of you sometimes." She allowed it because she understood the fear beneath his protectiveness. He had lost his mother to illness, understood too well how quickly life could be lost. His concern came from love, not from any desire to constrain her. So she compromised, accepting help while maintaining her independence, letting him care for her while insisting on her continued autonomy. The baby was born in early October, a daughter with Vincent's grey eyes and a temperament that suggested she had inherited her mother's determination. They named her Margaret after Vincent's mother, and Arabella fell in love with the tiny, fierce creature with an intensity that surprised her. "She's perfect," Vincent whispered, holding his daughter with the careful attention he brought to everything important. "Look at her. She's going to change the world." "She's 3 days old," Arabella smiled despite her exhaustion. "Give her time to develop opinions first." But watching Vincent with their daughter, seeing the tenderness and hope in his expression, Arabella felt something shift in her understanding of what they were building together. This wasn't just about their own happiness or their individual work. They were creating a family, a new generation that would inherit both their principles and their determination to live authentically. The weeks after Margaret's birth were simultaneously the most exhausting and most rewarding of Arabella's life. She had help, nurses and servants who handled much of the practical care, but she insisted on being actively involved in her daughter's early days. She nursed Margaret herself, despite society's expectation that aristocratic mothers would use wet nurses. She held her daughter for hours, studying the tiny features and imagining the person Margaret would become. Vincent was an involved father in ways that scandalized their household staff and delighted Arabella. He changed nappies without complaint, walked the floors with a crying infant, spoke to Margaret as though she could understand complex ideas even at a few weeks old. "You're teaching her philosophy," Arabella observed one evening, finding him reading Locke aloud to their sleeping daughter. "She should hear quality literature from the beginning." Vincent didn't look up from the book, his free hand gently stroking Margaret's back. "Besides, I find infant care less tedious when I'm also engaging my mind." They settled into new rhythms, adapting their lives to accommodate a child while refusing to abandon the work they considered important. The salons resumed when Margaret was 6 weeks old, with the baby sleeping in a basket in the corner, while adults debated social reform. Arabella returned to writing, though she now composed essays with a daughter at her breast, finding that motherhood sharpened rather than dulled her arguments about women's capabilities. "How you're still making people uncomfortable," Catherine Morrison said during one salon, watching Arabella nurse Margaret while simultaneously participating in a discussion about voting reform. "Most duchesses hide away for months after giving birth. You're here conducting intellectual salons with an infant. Most duchesses are pretending that babies emerge fully formed and require no actual parenting." Arabella adjusted Margaret's position without missing a beat in her argument about franchise expansion. "I see no reason to hide the reality of motherhood while discussing how society should be structured. They're related topics, actually." The first year of Margaret's life flew past in a blur of sleepless nights and remarkable developments. Their daughter was bright and curious, reaching milestones early and showing signs of the intelligence Arabella had hoped for. Vincent was besotted, his devotion to his daughter complete and unself-conscious. And Arabella discovered that motherhood didn't diminish her other work. It enhanced it, giving her new perspectives on questions of education, family structure, and social policy. She wrote about motherhood with the same honesty she brought to all her work, discussing both its joys and its challenges. The essays were controversial, predictably because aristocratic mothers weren't supposed to acknowledge that raising children could be difficult as well as rewarding. But they resonated with women across class lines, generating correspondence that suggested she was articulating experiences many felt but few dared express. "You're building something remarkable," Vincent said one evening as they watched Margaret sleep. "Not just our family, but a body of work that's actually changing how people think about marriage, motherhood, women's capabilities. I'm so proud of you. We're building it together." Arabella leaned against his shoulder, feeling the bone-deep satisfaction of a life well lived. "Every conversation we have, every salon we host, every small act of defiance against arbitrary rules, it all adds up. We're showing people that marriage can be partnership, that women can be mothers and thinkers, that happiness comes from authenticity rather than conformity." As Margaret grew into a precocious toddler, Arabella and Vincent expanded their efforts. They established a school for working-class girls, funding it with their own resources and recruiting teachers who shared their progressive views on education. Vincent used his parliamentary position to advocate for labor reforms, citing research Arabella had conducted and arguments she had developed. Together, they formed connections with reformers across England and Europe, becoming known as aristocrats who actually cared about social progress. The cost of their choices remained real. Vincent never regained the political standing he had sacrificed by refusing to constrain Arabella. Some opportunities were permanently closed to them, certain circles forever unwelcoming, but other opportunities emerged. Connections with people doing meaningful work, chances to make actual differences rather than simply maintaining appearances. "Do you ever regret it?" Arabella asked one afternoon as they watched Margaret play in the garden. "Everything you gave up for me, for us, for the life we chose?" Vincent was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. No, not even for a moment. I had wealth and position before I met you, but I was lonely. Successful by every measure society values, but fundamentally unfulfilled. You gave me partnership, purpose, a reason to use my advantages for something beyond personal advancement. That's worth infinitely more than political standing I never wanted in the first place. I love you. The words still carried weight even after years of marriage, still felt significant each time she spoke them. I love you too. Vincent pulled her close, both of them watching their daughter discover a butterfly and shriek with delight. Thank you for being brave enough to serve tea dressed as a maid, for being honest enough to challenge me, for being you without apology or compromise. Thank you for choosing me. The years continued to unfold with their particular mixture of challenge and triumph. Margaret grew into a child who asked difficult questions and refused simple answers, clearly inheriting both parents' intellectual curiosity. Arabella published a book compiling her essays, which became surprisingly successful despite, or perhaps because of, its controversial content. Vincent's legislative work bore fruit in gradual reforms that improved working conditions and expanded educational access. Their salons became institutions, places where genuine dialogue happened between people who might otherwise never have encountered each other's perspectives. Young couples sought their advice on building egalitarian marriages. Reformers found in them reliable allies with resources and connections. Writers discovered audiences they couldn't have reached without aristocratic sponsorship. They weren't perfect. Vincent's temper occasionally flared during parliamentary frustrations. Arabella sometimes pushed too hard on issues where patience would have been more effective. They argued occasionally fiercely about tactics and priorities and how to balance their various commitments. But they always circled back to the foundation of their partnership: mutual respect, genuine affection, shared purpose. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they returned to the ridge where Vincent had first brought Arabella, the place his mother had shown him as a child. Margaret, now 9 years old and already showing signs of becoming formidable in her own right, ran ahead while they walked more slowly. "Do you remember what I thought the day I met you?" Arabella asked, watching their daughter explore with fearless curiosity. "I thought you were either too perfect to be real or hiding something terrible. I was so suspicious of your motives, so convinced that happiness like this couldn't actually exist. And now?" Vincent took her hand, the gesture as natural after a decade as it had been revolutionary in the beginning. "Now I know it exists because we built it. Not because it was handed to us or because we got lucky, but because we chose each other and kept choosing each other every day since." Arabella turned to face him, seeing silver threading through his dark hair, lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and concern in equal measure. "We made this life, Vincent. Against all odds and despite all obstacles, we made something real and good and worth having." Vincent kissed her softly, a gesture of affection and partnership rather than passion. "We're not done yet. There's still so much to accomplish, so much that needs changing. Margaret will inherit a better world than we did, but there's work remaining for her generation and beyond. Then we'll keep working." Arabella smiled, feeling the weight of years and the anticipation of years ahead. Together, as we've always done. They stood together on that ridge, overlooking the valley where their story had begun, with their daughter's laughter echoing from somewhere ahead. The view was as beautiful as it had been a decade earlier, but now it was layered with memory and meaning, with all the moments that had brought them to this point. Arabella thought about the young woman she had been, so certain that marriage meant surrender, that choosing a partner required compromising herself. She thought about the risk she had taken dressing as a maid, the vulnerability of letting herself be seen, the courage required to believe that something different might be possible. She thought about Vincent, who had sought her out not despite her unconventional nature but because of it, who had built a life with her based on honesty and equality rather than tradition and expectation, who had proven day after day for 10 years that partnership could be real and not just a romantic fantasy. And she thought about Margaret, their fierce and brilliant daughter, who would grow up seeing her parents as equals, who would learn from their example that authenticity mattered more than approval, that meaningful work was worth social cost, that happiness came from being true to oneself, rather than conforming to others' expectations. "We did well," Vincent said softly, as though reading her thoughts. "We did extraordinarily well," Arabella agreed, "and we're going to continue doing well." Margaret called to them from ahead, something about flowers she had found and questions about their names. Vincent and Arabella exchanged a look that contained entire conversations, amusement at their daughter's endless curiosity, affection for each other, satisfaction with the life they had created together. They walked forward hand in hand, toward their daughter and their future, toward all the work that remained, and all the joy yet to be discovered. Behind them lay a decade of choices that had scandalized society and created something remarkable. Ahead lay unknown years, challenges they couldn't yet imagine, opportunities they hadn't yet discovered. But they would face it all together, as partners and equals, as they had from the beginning, as they would until the end, because some risks, it turned out, were absolutely worth taking, and some gambles paid off beyond all reasonable expectation. The story of how a duke came seeking a wife and found instead a partner, how a woman dressed as a maid and discovered her equal, how two people built a life based on truth rather than pretense, that story was still being written, one choice at a time, one brave moment after another. And it was, by any measure that mattered, an extraordinary success. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on Arabella and Vincent's remarkable journey. If their story of courage, partnership, and authentic love touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe to our channel, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and give us a like. Your support helps us continue bringing you these beautiful historical romances. Don't forget to activate notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, may you find the courage to be exactly who you are, and may you discover someone who loves you for precisely that reason.